Timing. Couldn't fault it. This last week, the Church of God farewelled Benedict XVI, Bishop Emeritus of Rome, who we now have hope is part of the Church Triumphant in the nearer presence of God. One of his predecessors... It's all right, mate. It's all right. One of his predecessors, Pope Paul VI, now officially Saint Paul VI, since his canonization in 2018, he was once asked what the greatest day of his life was. The greatest day of his life. What do you think he said? Any guesses? Sandra?
That he became...
Pope? Yeah, that's a good guess. Daniel? When he was born, that's a pretty good day, yeah. He actually said his baptism. His baptism was the greatest day of his life. Now, baptism, alongside the Eucharist, are the most important sacraments that we have due to their being commanded. It's too loud, am I? It's a bit quieter. They're the most important sacraments because they were directly commanded by Jesus himself. At the end of Matthew's Gospel, a direct instruction is given: go out into all the world, baptizing them. Baptism is important. That is why, for the most part, many ministers, not all though, try and make sure we don't give it away too easily, too cheaply. It's free of monetary cost, of course, but we do try and prepare people in some way. We prepare them because this really does matter to us. Baptism matters to us. Church buildings like ours can be designed in such a way to emphasise reminders of our baptism and in other ways encourage us in our discipleship. So the font is always present, often near the entryway, as a reminder that we enter the Church of God through the waters of baptism. That's why it's near the entry of the church. That's our entry point into the Church of God. And you may know that when we here, all three of us, are leading the people of God in worship, we wear an owl. And this is a version of the garment which, though in fashion history, is basically standard Greco-Roman civilian clothing, symbolically became a representation of baptism and being newly born and clothed with Christ, with a biblical echo to Revelation 7:14, those who have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. And the point is, we physically put on a sign of our first and fundamental identity as Christians, as baptized Christians. So whether our regular clothing is simple or luxury designer, whether it's ragged or tailored, that gives way to the garment of the baptized, which is our common inheritance. Jesus himself, he didn't need to get baptized. He didn't need to, but he did. And it shows that in him, God is committed to standing in and amongst the rest of us sinners. He stands in and amongst the rest of us. He's on our side to take us through the waters of baptism to the promised land. And I do personally particularly like the interpretation that Jesus was not baptized in order to wash away sin in himself and become holy in himself, but rather, by being baptized, Jesus was making the waters of baptism holy for us. Jesus made them holy for us. Hey, mate. It's all right, mate. Good to see you. I wanted to hold those reminders of baptism up to you because of what baptism says about how our identity is shaped by Jesus' identity. And I want to now explore how Jesus understood his identity and mission in light of the writings of the prophet Isaiah. And to put it very bluntly and simplistically, Isaiah, the book of the prophet Isaiah, is a particularly important book. It's sometimes even been called the fifth gospel because prophecies in that text are fulfilled in Jesus. And it's clear that Jesus took this text to heart as well, particularly what are commonly called the servant songs, which are in the second half of the book. He took them to heart. It should go without saying, of course, that those servant songs had a pre-Christian meaning too, which was relevant and meaningful for its first intended audience. But for Christians, it's hardly possible to engage with those texts without having Jesus in mind. Jesus' model of ministry, his model of ministry, was particularly influenced by those songs. So near the beginning of Luke's Gospel, he echoes the servant song to describe what he came to do. In Matthew 12, Jesus quotes some of the verses that we just heard this morning and says that all applies to him. And the qualities of that servant are, I think, quite surprising for an influential leader, but they do fit quite well with Jesus. The qualities are gentleness, steadfastness, being protective of that which is weak and struggling. And in that, slowly but faithfully bringing forth justice in the earth. I think it would be very interesting to see a politician try and operate on that sort of platform, not promising perfection or utopia, but a candidacy of slow, steady progress that protects in a figurative sense and attends to the faintly burning wicks which need help to burn brighter and buttresses bruised reeds so they can stand on their own. The point is, if this is the kind of Bible passage that Jesus was particularly caught up in, so it should be the case for us. And it's not meant to be a limited, narrow focus. The servant in Isaiah, which we can interpret as Jesus, is there as a light to the nations. Verse 6. A light to the nations. Mabel. With a focus on, as in verse 1, bringing justice to the nations. Light to the nations, justice to the nations. And I do believe that, as painfully slow as it is, as clumsy as it has been, as downright misguided and sinful as it has been at times, that the Church of God has, and still does, have that kind of influence to the nations. I believe that. And the theme of, just to pick one, the theme of bringing release to captives and prisoners is an especially resonant issue for the church. Not in the literal sense that we might hear it, but I think that that release is a biblical silhouette to that practice of Sabbath years and the Jubilee in the Old Testament. So that is when, in accordance with Leviticus 25, every 50 years, all slaves were to be released and land returned to original owners who had lost it through indebtedness or poverty. And that was kind of like a mega Sabbath year, which was every 7 years, the land was to be left to rest from agriculture, financial debts were forgiven, and slaves were released. Can you imagine if we did that today? That kind of pattern. But in that pattern of bringing released captives and prisoners, The Church of God has made good headway through the millennia. The Church of centuries ago made headway in stopping the slave trade and releasing those who were captives, though it took far longer than we might have liked. And the Church of today still does good work in opposing modern forms of slavery. And the Church of England has that as a particular focus in its priorities around social justice. Going back to baptism for the moment, reaffirming baptism as core, most important to Christian identity, has been a particular gift from the Reformation right through to the 20th century. It brought a reminder that ordained sacramental priesthood properly operates only as part of the priesthood of all believers. Our common priesthood is on behalf of the great high priest, like our identity as servants is after that of the true servant of all. And any time someone claims their identity in the servant, claims their identity in Christ through baptism, and seeks to serve in the pattern that he modelled, which was so strongly shaped by the prophet Isaiah, I think we can expect the blessing of God to be with us, to gift us with the strength we need, just as we are gifted with a delight in being claimed in relationship with God the Father through the Spirit as Jesus was. Now, after worship today, go back and read through that part of Isaiah that we heard. Read through it again. Or in a moment, as you are sprinkled, maybe a little bit soaked with water from the font, and imagine yourself rising up through the waters of baptism with Jesus, and these words from Isaiah impressing themselves upon you and calling for your response. Just imagine that, the waters of baptism going over you, with Jesus there with you, and those words impressing themselves upon you. They're calling for your response. And then respond. With thanks, praise, and a vision of justice and mercy after the prophets, respond. The Lord be with you.